Here we go. And here he is, Paul Taylor, U.S. Army. Paul, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, James. Pleasure to be here.
Well, you are active on LinkedIn. We've reconnected a couple of times over the years. We were both on active duty, not necessarily together, but in some of the same places over time. And it's great to reconnect like this. You have a particularly interesting story to share, and I want to get to that. But first, as we do with all our guests, I want to give you the chance to describe your active duty time in your own words.
Well, thank you. Yeah, my time in the military was wonderful and taught me a lot of different things. Of course, prepared me for transition, gave me a lot of relationships that still exist today that have helped me in my professional career. Largely, I think my career can be sort of divided into two parts. One is my traditional operations career where I was an armor officer after graduating from West Point, and I did a lot of the things that the normal career progression for an armor officer. I was a company grade officer at Fort Riley, Kansas, where I met my wife, and now we live in Kansas City. So that explains why I live there. And then I went on to successive responsibilities all the way through commanding at the squadron level in the 101st Airborne towards the end of my career, which was just an unbelievable assignment, storied traditions of that unit, and doing something that I never thought I'd get a chance to do. I also, as a mid-grade officer, as a major, 04, I did a congressional fellowship up on Capitol Hill. And I worked for a U.S. Senator, John Cornyn, from Texas, when he was serving on the Armed Services Committee. And I spent a year learning how Capitol Hill works. And I know, Gene, you've spent a lot of time doing similar things. Wonderful assignment, exposed me to a world outside of the Army, but really the benefit for the Army was we were developing a cadre of officers, not just officers, but non-commissioned officers as well, who can now help the Army do liaison work with Congress. And so after that, I went to the Pentagon and I served as a liaison to the Armed Services Committees in the Senate and the U.S. House for a couple of years. Then I went off and did that command assignment at Fort Campbell. And then at the end of my career, I went back to the Pentagon and did a little more specialized function, but still in congressional liaison. I worked in budget liaison, which is really a small office in the Army that has responsibility for doing all the liaison with the Senate and the House Appropriations Committees. Very fascinating assignment where we work closely with military construction and defense subcommittees on appropriations, trying to get money to support the things that the Army wanted to buy and the programs that it needed and to pay people and build infrastructure and whatnot. So great assignment. I loved it. I spent a couple more years doing that, and then I retired with 23 years in the Army as a colonel and went on to my post-military career.
A lot of people have a perception of what that congressional interaction is like and how Congress works. And it's often it's a gross misperception. And I, as you mentioned, had a similar opportunity while on active duty to be a liaison to Congress in a couple of different ways for the Navy. And it as you suggested, it's eye-opening to see how differently that branch of government works. And what people miss is that all of the money that supports and funds the executive branch is approved by Congress. And so it's only natural that there be some sort of communications channels that are formalized in a way that there are people with responsibility to maintain communications. And that's not lobbying. That's just the functioning of the branches of government communicating with one another about important things. And it set a foundation for my follow-on career that I did not anticipate. But we're going to talk about your career. And what I want to touch on at first is what got you thinking about transition? in your words, how did you know it was time, and what did you start to do to look at the transition options?
Sure. There was a couple inflection points, I think, for me. One was I had reached a logical point. I was over 20 years at that point. I ended up retiring with 23 years. But my kids were getting a little bit older, and we had always thought that if I retired, it would be nice to do that before our oldest daughter went into high school, so that at least we would be stabilized as a family for her whole 4 years of high school, and then obviously our younger daughters would have more stability being in one place. So we kind of had our eye on that. When I was in command too, I had some medical challenges, so I became non-deployable. I was diagnosed with cancer many years ago, and while it's in remission now, at the time I became non-deployable. So I was thinking about that too, and thinking, that long term, that the Army would expect me at some point to either retire or move to a deployable status. And I wasn't sure I could do that with my medical condition at the time. So I decided to retire. I was in '06 already. I'd reached kind of a point where it was right for myself and my family, and we made the decision.
We want to ignore the our mortality sometimes, and that I'm not going to get sick, but as you age, and so I it's no secret I'm 60. I think we're close in age. You might not have hit that magic number yet, but um, people are slow to recognize that they're not in complete control of some of the decisions, and that things happen, and you were dealt a card that you had to deal with. And it's great that you're talking about the sort of the holistic perspective of family and positioning. I've spoken before about having sort of sketched out some timelines for how old would the kids be at certain career points, or transition points, or points post active duty. And it's a reality that we all deal with. Maintaining a positive family environment takes work, and it's a balance of these things, especially when you're juggling career points, the medical opportunity, and the progression of your kids. So what did you do to identify work opportunities, or did you see something outside the fence line that interested you, or what were you thinking?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a process that everyone goes through, trying to figure out what they want to do after the military. I didn't know. Now, the benefit that I had, similar to your background, is I was working in a field that, unlike some of the more traditional assignments I had had in the military, I was working in a field in DC that directly translated to work in the Capitol, right? Working on Capitol Hill, becoming a lobbyist, doing some of those things that were very comfortable. I understood that world. I worked with a lot of people who had made that transition from the military to life in DC after that. So I did look. I spent a lot of time looking to see if there was a good fit. My family and I were open to staying in DC. But as we went through the transition, um, not because there wasn't any opportunities, but we started thinking it would be wonderful if we could be near our family, right? And so, of course, going back to the medical decision for me, I was at a point where I didn't know how well I was going to do. I'm very blessed to still be around at this point. But at that point, we just weren't sure, right? How much working life I would have, and we really thought that we wanted my family to be in a better spot near other family. So we chose Kansas City as a good target for our efforts because my wife's whole family is from near Kansas City. It's a great environment. It's fairly good cost of living. lots of industry, lots of jobs, a great place to raise the kids. We thought it would be a really good place for us, but it presented challenges. I was in DC, and now all of a sudden I was looking for a job, not just looking for a job in DC potentially, but also trying to network in Kansas City to see if there would be other opportunities there. I was just very lucky. And this is a theme throughout all of my experiences, is that my relationships helped me significantly. My relationships on Capitol Hill, especially offices that were from the Kansas City area, Missouri and Kansas. There were people that I knew who knew of a company that did work with the Department of Defense that was looking for someone to do a hybrid business development government relations role. I met the CEO of the company. It was a small startup, and we clicked, and I got a job in Kansas City, and I never looked back.
When you said hybrid, you were talking about government relations versus business development as the hybrid.
Yes.
Today we talk about hybrid in terms of remote. Were you working remotely at the
I
time?
was not. So
Yeah.
this job offered me, it was in Kansas City. It offered me an opportunity to, when I retired, for my family and I to relocate to Kansas City and start working in this job. And so it's interesting, right? There, when we say, two guys like us say government relations, we typically mean, liaising with the federal legislature. But to this company, it had a broad, definitely a broader context of not just liaisoning with Congress, but also with federal agencies, because they were the company's customers. So that's where it became a little bit more of a business development role, because when I was talking to government agencies, we were approaching them as potential customers for the products that the company sold, which were cybersecurity compliance tools.
So what did they see in you, Paul?
They saw
Not that we don't all see the total package here, but I want to hear your words. Why do you think they hired you?
Yeah, primarily they saw a person with deep relationships in DoD and Capitol Hill, which was helpful to the company.
And so I don't think you're still doing that work, but I don't want to get ahead of us.
Right.
What caused you to change horses in your post active duty life here?
Yeah, so and it's interesting, right? I meet with a lot of people who are transitioning out of the military, and one of the first things that I tell them is that, yeah, I'm just like you. I envision that I would retire or transition from the military. I would find a job. I would be incredibly happy. I'd do it for the rest of my life, and then I'd retire for good. And the reality is that for most people, that's not the script. So I think the sooner you figure out that there's a certain amount of flexibility required, and that you should be open to things post military, the better, because it's very unlikely that you're going to find that one unicorn, incredible resting spot right out of the military that you're going to love doing for the next 10, 15, 20, however many years you want to work until you retire. So I did that job for about a year. I don't know that I liked it a lot. I learned a lot. I learned a lot from being in a small business, from being in a startup, many things of which I wasn't hired to do, but I learned how to do, because when you're one of 10 people in a company, you very quickly learn that every day you're going to be doing something different. And it was fascinating. It was high paced. I liked it, but frankly, I got another opportunity at one point, and I was asked to, if I was interested in joining the team in Kansas City, with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And that's sort of the next chapter in my life.
And so how does that kind of approach happen? Your network comes to you, somebody tests the water with you, or you're having beer with somebody, or what? How does that come about?
Right. So for me, it's even stranger than that, I think. It's definitely goes back to my network and goes back to my time on Capitol Hill when I worked with a lot of the congressional delegation from, um, this area from the Midwest, Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas. And so when President Trump was elected, just like any new administration, they have to put together a whole slate of nominees for all of the appointed positions in the administration. And there are thousands of positions that they have to appoint. So these are non-career positions that are appointed at the beginning of every administration. I was asked to fill one of those jobs. So I was asked to fill the regional administrator position for FEMA Region 7, which was those four states: Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri. What most people don't maybe realize when they see people on TV, on C-SPAN, some of us still watch C-SPAN, going through confirmation hearings, is that those are the senior level officials in each agency in DC that the president appoints to those positions, and they have to be confirmed. But there are hundreds, if not 1,000 people below them, all of whom are appointed that don't require Senate confirmation. And, they go through a vetting process through their agency or prospective agency and the White House, and then they're appointed. So I was asked if I would be willing to serve in this position. I was very honored to be considered. Although initially I thought, well, emergency management, that's not something that I know a lot about. But I was encouraged by the people that nominated me, that it was a job that I could do, and they trusted me. So I went with it, right? It was a little bit of a leap of faith. And I was eventually accepted and nominated by the president to fill that position for for that administration until early 2021.
So, Paul, for those who might say, "Oh, well, he had special connections, or he knew people in Congress," um, that's that may be one way to look at it. But could you comment on the fact that this is ultimately another form of networking where
Right.
people knew you and your character and your overall skill set? You might not have known this precise lane, but they knew enough about you to recognize that you could do the job. And in the corporate world, sometimes those are called strategic hires, where the leadership may not know exactly how they're going to use you, but there's enough about you that is appealing that they know they can teach you the rest. And maybe you have a perspective on this, that it's not all about political connections.
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I think, yes, it is a little bit about political connection, but there are also political connections that were the result of a significant amount of work back and forth between the two parties over many years, right? So what I do get a lot from people is, well, hey, that's great. How do I do what you did? I know Senator X, or I know Congressman Y. And I said, well, that's great. You met them at a fundraiser, but I worked with them for 7 or 8 years closely, developed a personal relationship, traveled with them, right? Was responsible for helping their staff develop policy initiatives. Since I moved back to Kansas City, I've even been involved with them locally, right? So it's more than just I met a person once or twice relationship. It's something that involved a lot of work on both sides. And so, that's typically what I tell people. I say, listen, if you want to, you can't just reach out via LinkedIn and connect with someone, or do one phone call with someone and expect magic to happen, right? Relationships have to be cultivated, they have to be used, right? They take effort to be able to get to a point where one person is willing to do something for the other, right? Something significant. And to your point too, I think that yes, there's a perception that political appointments are handed out to people who are not qualified. Sometimes I will say that everyone that I dealt with who was a political appointee in the Department of Homeland Security or FEMA was, yes, they went through the same process as me, but they were incredibly qualified to do those jobs. Those people that make the nominations, either from Congress or from the administration, they look very hard to find qualified people to do those jobs. And so, for example, it wasn't just me having worked a couple of days in Congress and knew someone who then said, "Oh, Paul would be great for this job." It was, Paul's a retired colonel who's led successfully from, you know, a platoon level of 16 people all the way up to a squadron of 500 people. He's had responsibilities that overlap directly with what he'll be doing at FEMA, including logistics, operations, planning assignments. He's a good manager because he's proven that over time in the military. And he has those political relationships, which make those jobs a lot easier, because a lot of my job in FEMA was externally focused. It was to interface with mayors, governors, legislators. And so that skill set that, I honed on Capitol Hill really came back around to help me in this new job, because a lot of it was just working with people and putting up a big tent, bringing people into that tent, and then listening to them, and then making sure that we developed an action plan based on all the great ideas that were generated by really good, intelligent people coming together and thinking about hard problems.
And you're not just talking about proverbial tents here, are you, with FEMA?
No, actual tents, sometimes proverbial. But that's a lot of what FEMA does. It's a coordinating agency. And so FEMA has a lot of really good people that when disasters, that spend a lot of time preparing for disasters, trying to make sure they don't happen. But then when something bad happens, they go out and try to help people. But the reality is that FEMA, out of all the agencies that are involved with disaster relief, most of which are at the state and local level anyhow, but even at the federal level, FEMA is just one of many organizations that contribute to a disaster response and recovery. And so what FEMA really is the orchestrator of all of that response and recovery, with some informal authority over all those organizations and all those people.
So bring us up to speed, Paul. What are you doing now?
Right now, I work in emergency management, but in the private sector. So when I left FEMA in January of 21, because I was a political appointee, right? And so, people must always say, "Oh, that was terrible. You had to leave FEMA. Didn't you love that job?" And I said, "Yes, I really did love that job. It was a great opportunity for me. I loved the people that I worked with. I loved the work that I did." But you also, when you go into one of those jobs, you understand that there's, you're term limited, right? When a new administration comes in, they get to pick their people for those jobs. So I left and I went through another process of trying to find out what is it that I want to do. And one of the things that I knew I wanted to do is continue to work with the community and all those relationships that I had built during my time in FEMA, because they really are wonderful people. And so what I ended up doing was starting my own consulting business with one employee, myself. So I was the owner of the principal, a consultant, and I did the taxes too, right? You understand what it's like to run a small business. But I continued to help companies and sometimes nonprofits and government, different governments, state, local governments, work with FEMA, first of all, but also went back to my roots and did some defense related business and government relations, as much as I could do from Kansas City. And so I liked it. My practice was very specific to my skill set and people and relationships that I had. But I did that for about 2 years, and then I got an offer. I started talking to a big consulting company that did the same kind of work, only on a national scale, and they wanted me to serve in a regional role. So I've done that now for about a month. I just joined the company it's called Title Basin Group, and they are an amazing company that started working in the consulting world with emergency management, but now has grown towards doing all kinds of consultant type work across state, local, and federal government. They do grants management, program management, anything you can think of. Generally, if it's tied to spending some type of government dollars, they can help you with that project. And so I like it. I'm in a regional role. I cover the Midwest. So really my old FEMA region and then the Mountain West for the company. And I have a broad role which suits me just perfectly. I do, client development and client relationships management. I do some government relations because many of our customers are governments at all levels. I also have some role in overseeing ongoing operations, working with clients that we have a contract with anywhere in my region. So it's wonderful. It keeps me working with all the people that I still know from the FEMA world, not just FEMA, but emergency management world in general. But it's also allowing me to learn a whole bunch of new things about different sectors as well.
Paul, you mentioned the concept of openness earlier in the program, and it's very clear to me that you've been open to new opportunities and taking calculated risk in making some transitions, but that it's that ability to recognize that there might be something else or something more that could be both interesting and fulfilling just a little further down the road, and you've been open to those opportunities. Last question for you here. I like to ask people about balance. You've dealt with a lot of challenges. You've
Right.
navigated the transition and post active duty quite well. How do you approach balance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I've always approached it well, to be honest. When I was in the military, I know I didn't approach it well. I was very lucky that during most of the time in my military life, my wife stayed at home and really, had the large role in terms of making our family work and run our family as I ran around all over the place. And it didn't matter whether it was deploying to Iraq or working an 18-hour day in the Pentagon or Capitol Hill, right? I spent a lot of time prioritizing my work. And I know a lot of people like that. I think it's I don't know, it's not the right thing to do. But in my post-military career, I have always tried very hard to find ways to bring more balance to the equation. So for example, we um, after we retired, I say we, my wife and I, because it probably felt like she retired too. She went back to work full time for the first time in 20 years, right? So we were bringing some balance. We were allowing her to go back out and do something that she wanted to do. And that meant that I picked up a lot of the slack, but I was willing to do that, right? I wanted to do that because I had missed a lot of that early on when I was in the military. When I was at FEMA, it was difficult to do because FEMA, when there's something bad that happens, you're out the door, right? And you're going out to help your state and local partners. But it wasn't so turbulent for the majority of the time. FEMA was a good 8 to 5 kind of job. It was very stable, and I was able to start doing some of those things with my family that I had always missed out on when I was in the military. And then when I became a consultant, that was the wonderful thing about that. I ran my own company, I managed my life, and for the first time, I was really able to do all the things that I wanted to do. I was working from home, I was setting my own schedule, and really did like it. This company that I'm working for now, um, it's interesting because it feels great because I'm able to do a lot of the things I was able to do as an independent consultant, but do them so much better because I have this whole backbone, this whole team at Tidal Basin that they're technical experts in every kind of program that we want to help execute for people. And so, there wasn't when you're an independent, you have to do everything, right? So you could only pick the things that you think you'd be really good at. Now I can go out and I can talk to clients about a whole lot of things because I have this entire team behind me that is just wonderful at their job. That actually reduces a lot of the pressure, right? From being an independent consultant to working with this great new company. And I also work from home in that role. Now I do travel quite a bit because I have a regional responsibility, but for the most part, I'm home. I see my kids. With my wife all day when she's home. So it's much easier to manage those things. And I think that if you didn't do that in the military, which I doubt very many people did, especially very successful people in the military, because they just find themselves prioritizing their job over a lot of other things. I think you should definitely try to get to a point and a job where you can get to that point in your professional career after the military. And if you're not, I think you kind of need to question yourself, right? Now, listen, if you want a big corporate career and what it takes is some sacrifice on your and your family's part to get to a point where you can do that, I think that's all part of the plan if that's what you want to do. But I really do think that you owe it to your family, especially after the military, to get to a good point in your life.
Paul, it's a great answer. We've known each other a number of years, and I did not realize how many parallels there are in our personal stories, although we were in different services. But from the simple thing like marrying young and and then relocating to your wife's hometown, certainly done that. But the concept of working through it and figuring out what makes sense. How do you find balance? But I'm back to the openness and fulfillment that is so evident in your story, and it's great to hear. And thanks so much for being with us today, Paul Taylor.
Yeah. Thank you, Gene.